Hi, I'm Johna Johnson, CEO of Nemertes, here with my co-host John Burke.
CTO of Nemertes.
And today on Heavy Strategy, we are joined by Stephen Gaffney, CEO of the Stephen Gaffney Company and author of, among many other books, Just Tell the Truth, a book about how leaders can lead without lying. Stephen, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We've invited Stephen in part because of some great feedback we've gotten from our listeners. And back in November, Jeff wrote in and said, I listen to your pods and really enjoy them. Thank you very much. I'm a little disturbed by the comment that Johna made that all executives lie and she assumes it is normal to lie. She and her co-host are both executives, and if I worked for her, I'd be bothered by the admission that it's her expectation that all executives lie. I am a CIO and I would never intentionally lie. And then he goes on and explains a few things, but kind of weighed in saying, listen, the idea that executives lie is a terrible one. And then someone wrote in December and said, do CEOs lie? First, we must determine what is a lie. Absolute truth does not exist. And then he goes through and he says, well, do you really want your doctor to give you the absolute truth, your spouse? I'm guessing you don't want to hear, well, you're not my dream date, but you were the best I could get for now. I'm not approving of the lies, but really, do we want the honest truth? So certainly the whole question of whether and when and how and where to lie as an executive has really hit a nerve. And Stephen, my first question to you is, in your experience, why do executives lie? When and where do they lie?
Well, I don't know if they actually do lie the way this is set up, but I do think it's a problem as a whole when we consider this type of lie. And what I mean is lie of omission. So the biggest problem, and the number one thing I want to just tell people right off the bat, if they don't listen to the rest of the podcast, here's the most important point. The biggest problem is not what people say, it's what they don't say to each other. It's what they leave out. And that is basically what I call lies of omission. People go, well, I'm not so sure about that. I'll say, well, I mean, have you ever had somebody knowingly not say something to you? And how do you, when that happens, how do you feel towards that person? And if you're like most people, we feel lied to, right? Like, why didn't they tell us? So, but people will often get off the hook and say, well, I didn't lie because I didn't say anything. Well, I call that lies of omission. And when we consider that category, we all lie. They're all things that happen. And people go, I'm not so sure. I tell people everything. Well, let me just explain. It's physically impossible. Let me explain this. The people speak at anywhere between 150 to 200 words per minute, but we all think anywhere between 600 to 1200, and some say even faster words per minute, which means that no matter what, we're always editing. Our mind is moving faster than our mouth, let alone if we have a dialogue with someone. So we always are withholding. But the question is, are we withholding important information or needless information? Are we withholding facts or are we withholding opinions? I mean, because everybody has opinions, right? But are we withholding necessary facts? So I love how you're teeing this up because it's an important subject because everybody agrees honesty is the best policy. But the question is, and the difficulty is in execution.
I have to say, please don't stop listening now because the conversation is going to go on and be very interesting. So on the idea that you don't have to lie and the implication that you're giving us that you don't even have to lie by omission except necessary editing for, the physical realities of speaking. How do you lead without even the lies of omission?
Well, here's the thing. So as an executive and leaders out there, the question is, are we really being forthcoming? So here's an easy example of this. You've got to make some changes in the company or on your team. And do you bring it up or do you not? Because if you bring it up, you might be afraid that high achievers might leave. So you try to quell the fears and say everything is fine. But if the reality is things are not fine, we might withhold things because we don't want to worry people. But ultimately, in the end, people find out the truth. We find this out universally, which we can get to because people often raise, do we live in a more dishonest world than not? And we can kind of address that. But here's the point, is if we withhold that information and ultimately, in the end, they find out the truth, people will feel lied to. So let me give you a specific example. I was brought into a company where they had essentially withheld and didn't tell people that there were going to be these layoffs. Then there were these layoffs. And the idea was they didn't want to worry people who were high achievers. Well, guess what happened when they announced the layoffs? They announced it, and the high achievers, many of them left. Why? Because trust was broken. And so even if we say, hey, look, everything's okay now, is it? And so generally the best people often who can leave will leave when there's other options. Now, I'm not saying everybody's going to leave who's a high achiever, but if you really want to protect high achievers, which is ultimately the goal in any leadership, right? We want the high achievers. It's to be as forthcoming as possible. And we can talk about how to execute on that. But it is really complicated. And also even mergers and acquisitions. I'll just say this, where lawyers say, well, you can't say anything. And I'm not a lawyer, but here's the thing. If you withhold information and you're selling the company, ultimately, okay, legally that might be okay. But in the end, when people find out the truth, they find out trust will be broken. And again, high achievers will leave. So it's a difficult thing. Again, I want to come back to a central theme. This stuff is easy to talk about, hard to execute. And that's why we do so much work with companies.
And I think one of the most important things to think through, and I don't know the answer on this one by any means, is when do you know something? When do you only suspect something? And when is it, at the base of, when is it more like I have this fear that something is true? And where down that scale, I fear it's true, I suspect it's true, I now know it's true. Where along there do you start disclosing? Where along there does openness require that you share the fact that you think something's going to happen, even though you don't yet know?
It's a great question, right? When do we think it's the right move? And generally, when we're debating whether it's the right move, it's time to share. It's like when we're debating in our head. It's like, time to get it out. Should I bring it up?
John,
Should I not? Bring it up now. And that's really the key. And it is tough, right? Because let's face it, we've all met people who say, you know what? I love honesty. You can say anything to me. I appreciate honest feedback. And then you give them honest feedback and they flip out.
Right.
Next time they ask us for honest feedback, we all kind of hide or lie or whatever. There's actually people in our lives, and I think we all have people like this, hopefully not many, but who have trained us to lie to them. And I often say to audiences, are there people right now that will ask you something and you're like, oh, don't go there? And they all laugh because we all have those types of people, which is unfortunate. The key is, as a leadership, are we training people to be upfront or do we react? Right? Everybody says, I love honest feedback. But what happens if one of the employees says, I can't achieve my job, or those goals are too high, or I'm not sure what to do? Do we kind of react to them in a negative way? That's a problem. Or how about this one? I just kind of want to expand it to show how difficult this is. You're leading a meeting and somebody's like texting under the table or doing other things. That's creating an environment where people don't feel comfortable to share because it looks like other people are disinterested, or eyes rolling, or arms crossed, or whatever. So leaders need to manage distractions because I've been brought into many organizations. They don't manage this. They don't set guidelines, and they have these meetings where people are doing other things. And basically people say it's useless to share. So then employees stop sharing and leaders go, I can't believe they didn't bring it up. Did you create the environment where it was safe and people felt rewarded to bring up things?
Well, that's actually an interesting point, Stephen, because you're highlighting the fact that there's many facets to honesty. And one facet, if you wish to receive honesty, is you have to actually convey that you care. Yeah. And I mean, it doesn't sound difficult, but what you just described is to convey that you care, you have to listen. You have to convey that you've actually understood what the person is telling you, including the nuances behind it. And active listening is a form of active honesty, I guess is the way I would put it. And that's a really interesting point that I don't think people think about enough. Go ahead.
And what I want to bring up is that's not even good enough. It's not only that we listen, that we get it, but we need to do something with that feedback. I've been brought into many organizations where they say it's safe to bring things up, but it's useless to share. Nothing changes. Or how about this? Organizations that hire these consultant firms and do these surveys or whatever, and they take 6 to 8 months to get the information back to employees about what they found out. And even worse than that, they don't do anything with it. So it's not just reporting back. It's not even just acknowledging. You got to do something with that information. So people say, okay, I got it. And then I love to pose this question. How do you make people feel rewarded when you're ultimately going to decide something against what they're advising? That's the tricky part. So I always pose it like you got A versus B option, and you ask people for feedback. And after that, you collect the information. You think, I'm going to go with B. Now, what do you say to all those people that had said, I love A option? What do you do? How do you make them feel rewarded? And when I bring this up, people go, well, I want to thank them. I want to acknowledge them. I said, that's not good enough.
No, that's
Yeah.
not enough. What I do in those cases, and you can tell me whether this is
Yeah.
enough or not, is I say, thank you for this. Here is what we thought about in addition to the points that you made. You made these 3 points. Here are these 5 points that you didn't make. And the problem is they outweigh the 3 points that you made in the bigger picture, which
I love
gives
it.
them the context, which says, I heard you. I'm deciding against what you said, but here's why. And the other thing that I would strongly recommend, and I'm actually going through something like this in my personal life, where there's an entity I'm involved with where the leadership has not been honest in the way we're talking about. The other thing you've got to do is, if you're going to do that, give them time to respond to the 5 things you raised. So in other words, don't say, I've already made that decision. Here's the reasons why. Thank you for your input. But say, I'm about to make this decision. Here are the 5 reasons why. Is there anything you feel that I'm missing before I pull the trigger? And you don't have to give them a lot of time, but the difference between giving them 5 minutes of advance warning versus, any amount of time afterwards is huge. Because if you're saying, here, I heard what you said, here's what I think, goodbye, it's still kind of shutting them down, even if you give them good reasons. Now, you can't
Absolutely.
always do that.
Well, and I would add something else that you can also do. And this is what the big kind of needle mover. Find a piece of gold in option A. So an example might be, so folks just want to be upfront. We've decided, or maybe you give them time, as you're saying, but whenever we're making that decision, we're going with option B. For those of you who gave us option A, we really appreciate the feedback, because out of your feedback, we realize that if we're going to go, and we are with option B, we need to build a case study and show you why that's advantageous. We hadn't thought about that. So that was very useful. And we are modifying option B to make sure it's really strong. So thank you for your feedback. The point is, we may not be able to do it perfectly, but you have to show people feel rewarded for their feedback.
Well, and there's another, I'm going to put in a side note on this because it's actually a topic that a lot of our clients are concerned about, which has to do with innovation. And everybody loves the idea gathering phase of innovation. Oh, yes, we take everybody's ideas. It's great. And my question is, what do you do with the ideas you discard? And in a sense, you have to kind of do the same thing, which is you get back to the people and you say, these ideas were discarded for these reasons, and list them, or not discarded, but put on the shelf. And oh, by the way, we will revisit them if batteries get low cost enough below a certain point, the weight develops that it can be cheaper than this. Those will be triggers for us to pick up those ideas again because they may be viable again. And then if you circle back and revisit those ideas as conditions change, people are thrilled that an idea that was put on the shelf 5 years ago because the world wasn't ready for it yet got picked up 5 years later when the world got ready for it.
I love it. And it reminds me, for the listeners, if they send us an email that they listen to the show, I'll send them the 13 barriers to daily innovation. Everybody's talking about
that's a great
products.
idea. Yeah.
But we have to innovate daily in our jobs. So what are the barriers that hold organizations back from doing that? And what do you do about it? An example would be organizational folklore. People say, we tried that and it never worked. Well, did we try it exactly like that? And what exactly happened? And so there are many barriers.
And what's changed since? Yeah.
Correct. Yep. Absolutely. And Jonah, to your point, that the idea of rewarding people for their ideas. In fact, there's a book called Ideas Are Free, and people can read the book, or I'm going to give them the main idea. The number one thing that motivated employees to give ideas is to show that you'll use their ideas.
Right.
And people might say, well, I can't use all of them, but will use some of them? I remember this kind of funny, years ago, this U.S. general called me and he said, look, I take to heart what you've said. And we've had a lot of ideas from the workforce, but now it's dwindling. And I can't understand why, because we're using those, at least some of the ideas, and we're trying to use a lot of them. I said, well, how are you letting the workforce know
Right.
that you've used those ideas? And it was over the phone, and there was no response.
You were like, I think I figured it out.
You know? And he goes, I'm thinking, that's a great point. We're using the ideas, but we forgot to let the workforce know that we're using those ideas. So sometimes it's little tweaks that make a big difference.
Yeah, attribution is always welcome in especially the tech community. People love it when you acknowledge that an idea was theirs to start with. And in the tech environment, I'll speak from personal experience on both sides of this. Folks are sometimes, I don't want to say honest to a fault, but maybe flawed in their expression of what they're trying to honestly say. And they can be a little crushing, they can be a little dismissive or a lot dismissive. The flame wars of the 90s were a great example of people being deeply honest with each other in ways that were thoroughly counterproductive. So how do you nudge people out of that?
Thank you for bringing that up, because there's a difference between honesty and brutality.
Yep.
And what you're bringing up reminds me, I had this lady at a session of mine, and it was at the very beginning, or right before I was about to start. And this lady goes, well, I'm really glad you're teaching honesty. People need to understand the value of honesty. I'm honest, and people don't appreciate it. And I said, well, let me hear some of the honesty. What have you been saying to people? And she said, when I think people are an idiot, I tell them. And I said, well, that's not. I said, well, that's not honesty. That's brutality. That's name calling. The key is what's really going on. So there's a world of difference between somebody saying that versus, look, I noticed a report. You said it was going to come in at 3:00. It came in at 5:00, and it's not coming in on time. What's going on? Or this is really bothering me. And so we can talk about that, but being more fact-based and emotion-based, which we can get to, is really critical, because that's really the ultimate in honesty. What are the facts, and how do we feel about those facts? It's not necessarily that we had to share all of our opinions, and some of it is brutal. I often say to people, oh, this is really neat, is we do a exercise that proves to people that 50 to 70% of what they're thinking about on a daily basis is incorrect. So people are more likely to be wrong than right. That may sound strange to people, but here's the point: is if we take that on to heart, take that on, that means that a lot of people have these opinions, and we don't have to share them all, because a lot of them may be off base. But the key is the facts and the emotions, which we can talk about.
Well, and I think being honest about your emotions is another thing that it's a key piece of leadership and an effective, energized workforce, not to the point where you want something to be a therapy session for everyone involved. That's just going too far. But if somebody says, I'm really uncomfortable with that, and I can't quite articulate why, you need an environment that allows that person the time and the space, within reason, to figure out what they're actually objecting to, because it might be really important. And that can even be the leader. And I've worked with clients that are comfortable saying that, and that makes a world of difference when you're trying to do an organization, because sometimes you may have an intrinsic opposition or desire to do something. You can't say why, and you don't want to get put in a position where you're defending something you're not even sure you intellectually believe, but you still feel like there's a there. And so being honest about your feelings is important.
Yeah, and something else you're bringing up is giving people the time to digest. But some people can immediately react, and sometimes the reaction isn't the best. and others just need time to process, and it's actually good. And so that also deals with how people are comfortable giving feedback. If the only way we're allowing people to give feedback to the leadership is through these town halls, that's not the most effective.
No.
Some people are comfortable with that, but some it's one-on-one, some of it's small groups. We just have to realize that it comes out differently. Now, obviously, we're professionals, and there's certain settings. I mean, we can't baby everybody in the workplace, but people often make the assumption, well, if I were them, well, we're not them. Right. So it's really understanding. It reminds me, I had a consultant friend of mine, Zamira Jones, who was the president of ABC Radio out of Chicago. And he told me something years ago that really made a lasting impression. He said, great leaders visit people in their neighborhood. Poor
Mm.
leaders want people to come to their own neighborhood. In other words, visiting employees where they're at and really getting where they're at and understanding there's different styles. Poor leadership is this is the way I am, and they just need to realize that. And that's poor leadership. I mean, you look at coaching, even in athletes, understanding that athletes are different and it's just people are different. So a little compassion goes a long way too.
Well, one thing it took me a very, very long time to learn is that typically people treat you the way they want to be treated, not necessarily with the golden rule, but at a practical level. For example, I worked with a colleague who was always giving me a piece of information well before I needed it. And it drove me crazy because I'm one of those people that reacts quickly, not necessarily any better than anyone else, but not necessarily any worse. But I just process quickly. And they were not. And they wanted the opportunity to sleep on something, maybe a night, maybe 2 nights if it was a major decision. And so they would make a habit of giving me this information early. And I'd be like, what do you want me to do with this? If we're not making a decision right this minute, why do I need this information? And I finally realized I may not, but they do. And so I learned that you sort of seed the thinking and you get a richer result. Or another great example is somebody that I work with. Almost you can set your watch by their second decision. They'll be in a position, it may be under incredible time crunch, it may be an emergency, and they'll make a decision that seems absolutely 100 correct, justify it quickly, and all you have to do is say, that sounds really brilliant, and wait. And then they'll stop, second guess themselves, and their second decision is better. And it's like, once you know that about them, you never say, oh, that's a bad idea because blah, 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 because they're going to get there anyway.
Yeah.
And they may think of something you didn't think of, but you have to know that about them and get used to it.
It's so true. Even in personal life, I appreciate your example. It makes me think of my mom. So the reason why is my mom, she's obviously the most wonderful woman, a little bit biased, but anyway, so, but when I was growing up, when I asked her to do certain things or, more later in life, but she would say no. But I learned that if I don't react, she always ended up doing it. I mean, she did everything for the kids, but it was just like an initial reaction. It was because trying to evaluate and not wanting to hurt somebody or overpromise or whatever. But if I just let her be, she would come around. And so I love what you're saying because it's understanding people's style. And, that's what great leadership is understanding other people's world and visiting them and their world and then taking them to our world, but not do it our way first.
Well, and I'd like to come back to something you raised at the beginning, because I think that's so important that we have to highlight it. The whole sins of omission thing. And I think, John, you raised something too, which is there are reasons people don't tell the whole truth. One is time and bandwidth. It's not possible to tell the whole truth, and people's eyes will glaze over in a second if you start telling all the details that are irrelevant. So a leader or any employee's job is to filter the truth to what is relevant. But then how do you know what's relevant? And I think there's 2 huge problems that people have. Well, 3 possibly. One is obviously that they try not to disclose things that make them uncomfortable and they don't know how to deal with it. Like, oh, the company's about to be bought and I can't tell you that. But another one is they genuinely don't know what details might have an impact. I mean, we've all had this, especially in the tech world, where there's one tiny detail that you forgot to mention that changes everything because the entire team goes, oh my God, we can't do that. It's going to take like 5 years to retrofit all the systems in order to make that possible. And you just toss that in there as the last minute, like no way. So one of the challenges is knowing what's relevant. And then John's point, John, your point was sometimes you're not sure what you know, and you've trained yourself to keep quiet when you don't know something for sure. And yet sometimes it's important to bring it up and say, here is a thing that I don't know for sure, but I strongly suspect, and sort of frame it that way.
I agree. And so the key is, so what do we do about this? And one of the big needle movers to creating that environment where people will share stuff is to create emotional safety. And on purpose, I'm saying emotional safety, not psychological safety, which is most of the stuff out there. My argument against psychological safety is my experience is, and I've been at this almost 30 years, is the number one reason why people don't share or are hesitant to share is because of fear. And so people can cognitively, psychologically get it's okay to share. Nothing bad is going to happen, but they need to feel safe to bring it up. And some people feel uncomfortable. Again, I'm not making it right or wrong, but what we need to do is create that environment where people feel safe, watching people's reaction, eliminating distractions, and asking questions, encouraging people to share, because it takes a lot more psychological energy, interesting enough, to keep something inside than to let it out. If you've ever had that experience, right, you keep it inside, it's stressful. But if you feel safe to bring it up and you can let it out, then it's actually relieving. So the key is to create an emotionally safe environment. And because people make decisions and react out of emotions, it's not so much the psychological. It really is the emotional gut feeling. I feel okay to bring it up.
And it's important to keep in mind, and this is like primate psychology 101, we are heavily weighted towards remembering the bad things that happen to us so we can avoid having them happen to us again. So each time that you break faith, each time that you lie and are caught, or each time that you treat somebody badly for telling you the truth, you are creating a huge deficit and roadblock that many acts of respectful hearing of the truth and many acts of sharing the truth will have to go into overcoming.
Yes. I love what you brought up, because we do tend to remember it. People might be listening now and saying, oh my gosh, I get defensive. Well, when they, after the podcast is over, go apologize to people. Look, we all have bad days. We've all reacted, right? And we will occasionally, react. And hopefully it's less than in the past or whatever, but we all have bad days. And the key thing is own up to it and say, hey, I'm sorry about the way I reacted. You told me something that hurt my feelings, but I'm glad you told me, because I'd rather you tell me than not. And I'm sorry I reacted that way. It's interesting when we look at apologies, they go a long way. I think there was some research done years ago where doctors who apologize are actually less likely to be sued. Now, I'm not a lawyer or medical profession, but it is interesting.
Stephen, I was absolutely blown away. My mother was in the hospital earlier this year for some treatment, and her roommate, no, it was actually a mistake that they made for her. And they literally walked in and said, we made this mistake. This should not have happened. We are terribly sorry. And it was just sort of one of those things where you go, oh, okay, got it. Like, nobody died. It was painful and uncomfortable and unnecessary, but nobody died. It was not a major thing. And I remember thinking, good heavens, this hospital is impressive. You're not supposed to say that. And I do think, actually, I think that's an excellent point, because I think one of the reasons that senior leaders often lie is not just that they are uncomfortable telling the truth, they are frightened telling the truth, but it's also been impressed on them with their training by their legal teams that they can't, that telling, either inaccurately saying something that turns out not to be true is so risky that they're better off saying nothing at all, or that they may not tell the truth because anything you say can and will be used against you, which is the legal perspective on a lot of things.
I appreciate you bringing that up too, because it's unfortunate. So what I coach a lot of leaders are, I say, I'm not a legal professional, I'm not a lawyer, but push back on your lawyers and say, where does it say I can't say that? Because this goes back to organizational folklore. A lot of times people have these things like, you can't give honest feedback in a performance evaluation. I'm not saying you can't, you can. But the thing is, and how do you do it or whatever? But you're right. There's this culture out there where you're not saying things, which doesn't really help. Or the other thing that's really tough is this culture of blame and not taking responsibility. And the constant thing, don't take responsibility, because then bad things are going to happen. And so, look, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't officially say something. There's not legal advice. This is human being advice. Take responsibility and apologize. We all make mistakes. And even the way we apologize, right? Have you ever had somebody say, well, I'm sorry you feel that way? Or
that's not an apology. Yes.
Exactly. Instead of I'm sorry, period.
Right.
I didn't intend for that, and I'm sorry. So let's talk about what I can do moving forward. So it's just interesting about this culture of blame and not taking responsibility. The other thing, which is a kind of a side note, side note, we can talk all about culture, but another thing that people have to deal with is we live in a world in which people are assumed guilty until proven innocent,
Mm-hmm.
which is really tough, right? You read in the news that somebody makes an accusation against a company or whatever, or an individual, and it's presumed that they're guilty, and then they have to justify that they're innocent, which is wrong. Our country is founded on the principle people are innocent until proven guilty. The same applies for organizations. And I say this because inside of companies, they'll hear hearsay information and the people say that's the truth. I'm like, do you know that for sure? Have you seen that be the case? And check that out. So it's also this assumption that people are guilty instead of really dealing with people's reputation. And the other thing is that I've seen, sorry, I'm getting on a roll here, but
That's okay.
I just feel passionate about this, where people are not honorable about what they'll say about other people, about another person. That person yelled at me. Well, did they yell? Was yelling it, or will they raise their voice slightly, or they're bullying, right? And this whole thing, what exactly is the case? And I've been brought into organizations where a leader has held somebody accountable. The person then made an accusation that wasn't true. They had to do a whole investigation. That leader was proven innocent. But here's the problem. People never remember that the person was proven innocent. They just remember the charge. And so I say this because when we're talked about honesty, it is important to be forthcoming, but we have to watch what we say about people and honor people's reputation.
And be kind.
Yeah.
It's a simple piece of advice, but you gotta think it all the time. When you're giving people tough feedback, when you're firing people or laying them
Yeah.
off, be kind. Don't be a
Yes.
robot and don't be dismissive. Uh, you don't have to soft pedal what you're saying, but you have to be kind.
John, I'm
Yeah.
just really glad we didn't work together back when I was in my 30s. I was not kind. Let's just leave it at that. But no, I do agree with that. I also think the impact that that kind of thing has on corporate culture and on leadership should not be forgotten, because if essentially you make the mistake of being a little too rough or giving feedback that hurts somebody's feelings, and then you get investigated and you're proven innocent, but still the cloud hangs over you, the chances are very good that the next time around, what you're going to do is not give the person feedback, but just sideline them. This person's never going anywhere, but I'm not going to tell them that, because they're going to cause me more difficulty if I have that conversation with them than if I don't. So I'm just going to quietly sideline them, put them in a position where they're not having any influence, and wait for them to figure it out and go somewhere else. And leaders do it all the time. And I
They
have to
do.
say, it's an incredibly effective management technique, because people start to realize they're getting frozen out and they can't figure it out, and nothing ever rises to the level of something they can legitimately complain about. So eventually they just take the next offer, whether it's outside the company or internal. And if this is happening to you, because it has happened to all of us, the flip side is you need to think in terms of sitting down with the person who's doing that, even if they're your boss or your manager, and having a tough conversation with them. Maybe not the toughest conversation, but start small and see how they react. Hey, I noticed you didn't solicit my opinion in the meeting last week. You solicited everyone else's. Was that just an oversight? You know, as opposed to, hey, that meeting is the 577th meeting that you haven't paid any attention to me and talked over me when I spoke and whatever. And get a sense of what that is. The goal is to work yourself up to where you can have a conversation that says, look, I legit feel like I'm being sidelined here. Is there a reason for that? And the person answers yes, and here is the reason. And that kind of conversation, surprisingly, can end in a good working relationship if both parties are honest. It's unlikely, it's not probable, but it can get there. And if you actually really like your job and your main problem is this person who's trying to cut you off, it's worth trying. There's also great workarounds that have nothing to do with honesty, but we won't go into those.
Well, I really appreciate what you're saying, because it's also assuming good intent when we're approaching somebody. That goes a long way. And because again, tone is five times the impact of the words we say. So, why didn't you ask me for feedback? That's going to put the person on guard versus, hey, I noticed you asked other people. Maybe I missed the point, but is there something I'm doing that I do not ask me? Or is there something I can do to give you better feedback or whatever the case may be? That's one thing. The other thing is we need to give leaders a break because
Mhm.
it's a tough job. And here's why I'm saying this. I often say to people, have you ever been in a situation where you were really hard on your boss or your leader? Maybe not direct to them, but think I could do it better, whatever. And then you get promoted into that position and you realize it wasn't so easy. And it's like parents, I always would say to people, I've never been blessed to have children, but I've had a lot of parents in my sessions. And I'll say, have you ever complained about your parents and oh, I'll do a better job. And then you're a parent and it's not so easy, is it? And that's because people have given me feedback. And so the point is, we're really tough on the people above instead of saying, I don't really know what it's like to be in their position. We're seeing this, but they may be aware of so many other political stuff. And I don't mean politics per se, like on the national news, but I mean politics or stuff in an organization and things and relationships that we may be unaware of. So we got to give people a break. So be kind, assume good intent, and give people a break.
Yeah, well, and I think we're touching on the last point that I think we have time to make, which is at Nemertes, we offer adaptive leadership training. And one of the parts of adaptive leadership training is that it trains everyone to be a leader. And one of the very interesting things that happens, getting back to the whole, sins of omission here, is that at the beginning, what we do is we set up a situation and we are in a position of leadership to set up the situation, and then we hand it over to the people to execute on it. And we intentionally do not give them all of the information. And the more junior people will not ask for that information. But then when you do the after action review and assessment, they get mad because you didn't give it to them. And then when you say, well, you didn't ask, the idea that as an employee, it's your job to get all the information you need from your leader, because you have to assume that your leader may not be giving you all the relevant information for all the reasons we talked about, only some of which are nefarious. The fact that you have that responsibility as an employee is actually not something that goes over super well, largely because of the way we teach people in schools. The idea is there's a teacher at the front of the classroom, and the teacher gives you what you need to know and assigns the assignment, and the students do the assignment. And there's no sense of the student saying, hey, teach, what if we did a different assignment that would help us learn these other skills? You're not allowed to have that conversation when you're a student. And yet when you're an employee, that is actually kind of what we're expecting. Certainly as someone who is a white collar employee, your job is to actually think about different ways to solve the problem and give us feedback on how to do that.
I love it because it reminds me about how in life, the only person we can control is ourselves, and to not play the blame game, but spend 100% of your energy on what we're going to do about it. That deals with the latest book, Unconditional Power, which of course we could get into, or maybe on another podcast, but about the desirable state is being unconditionally powerful, meaning recognizing conditions, but essentially spending 100% of our energy on what we're going to do about it. So let's say we do have a bad boss, or we do have we have a good boss, or we have poor resource, whatever. The central thing we want to focus on is what's within our control. And spend 100% of our energy. And the story I love to share is in 2009, I got diagnosed with cancer and also went through obviously the Great Recession and the cut, as we all know, during that period, as many downtimes, they'll cut consulting type services. And so faced with a lot of headwind, I could have done the blame game, but I couldn't control that I had cancer, but I could control how I responded to cancer. I couldn't control that there was a recession, but I could control how I was going to respond to the recession. And what I decided to do is retool my business. And from that year on, we've had our best years ever in business. It's not that I'm that smart. It's just you focus on 100% of what we can control. So there are 12 essential elements that when I work with high-end teams, and people we can send them the list or whatever, but one of them is taking responsibility for our attitude and actions. So it's wherever we're at, instead of focusing there, focus, what are we going to do about it? That's the most important question.
Yes, and I will add to the plug for unconditional power, because After I knew we were going to have you on the show, I figured, I should probably read a few more of his books. And I saw that one. I was like, what a goofy name. Like it seems like he's trying to nurture megalomaniacs. And then I realized that you chose the words very specifically because conditional power is power that comes from something outside you. Unconditional power is power that comes from you. And the point is, you have the ability to be unconditionally powerful. If all of your power is conditional, you're in trouble. And it's actually it's an interesting way to look at things. And I do urge people to look at it. That said, I think we're pretty much at the end of this episode. So Stephen, if people want to find you, where should they go to find you?
So they can go to our website. There's many different ways to get to it, but let me give it easy. JustBeHonest.com, which is the name of my first book. So if they go to JustBeHonest.com, it'll take us there. And if they said that they listened to us, the podcast, and they send us an email, and it's easy because about us, and you can see how to contact us. We'll send them the 13 barriers to daily innovation and what specifically to do about that. And we can also send them another article about unconditional power and specific strategies about what they can do about that. And if people have challenges with their team, we mostly do a lot of work in the area of high achieving teams and making high achieving teams. So we can send them an article on that. But at least if they want the 13 barriers, to just let us know and we'll send that to them.
Okay. And that's justbehonest.com. And that's, again, Stephen Gaffney at the Stephen Gaffney Company. There's also stephengaffney.com if they wish to look you up. And they can certainly find you on LinkedIn as well. That's Gaffney and Stephen with a V. So Stephen Gaffney. Thank you very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. And hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.